Our story today is called Curious George. And Curious George, this one is just one of the many stories written about Curious George, but they were written by a couple actually, a man and a woman. Her name was Margaret Ray, and his name was H.A. Ray. But on the cover of this one, it says Curious George by H.A. Ray. Margaret actually did the writing, and H.A. Ray, her husband, did all the illustrations. Okay, we're going to go to the story. This is George. He lived in Africa. He was very happy, but he had one fault. He was too curious. Remember, in school, we've talked about the word curious and what curious means. Curious means that you want to know about something, and so you do what you can to find out about it, which is sometimes a good thing. One day, George saw a man. He had on a large yellow straw hat. The man saw George, too. What a nice little monkey, he thought. I would like to take him home with me. The man put on his hat. Let me read that again. The man put his hat on the ground, and of course, George was curious. He came down from the tree to look at the large yellow hat. The hat had been on the man's head. George thought it would be nice to have it on his own head. He picked it up and put it on. The hat covered George's head. He couldn't see. The man picked him up quickly and popped him in a bag. George was caught. On the big ship, things began to happen. The man took off the bag. George sat on a little stool, and the man said, George, I am going to take you to a big zoo in a big city. You will like it there. Now run along and play, but don't get into trouble. George promised to be good, but it is easy for little monkeys to forget. On the deck, he found some seagulls, those birds. He wondered how they could fly. He was very curious. Finally, he had to try. It looked easy, but what do you think will happen to George next? I missed a line down here. It says, oh, what happened? That doesn't sound good. First this, and then this. Where is George? The sailors looked and looked. At last they saw him, struggling in the water and almost tired out. Man overboard, the sailors cried as they threw him a lifebelt. George caught it and held on tight. At last he was safe on board. Poor George. After that, George was more careful to be a good monkey, until at last their long trip was over. George said goodbye to the kind sailors and he and the man with the yellow hat walked off the ship and onto the shore, and then on into the city to the man's house. After a good meal and a good pipe, George felt very tired. He crawled into bed and fell asleep at once. The next morning, the man telephoned the zoo. George watched him. He was fascinated. And then the man went away. George was curious. Uh-oh. He wanted to telephone too. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, what fun! This telephone looks kind of like the telephone we had at my house when I was your age. And we had it for quite some time. Ding-a-ling! Ding-a-ling! George had telephoned the fire station. The firemen rushed to the telephone. Hello, hello, they said, but there was no answer. Then they looked for the signal on the big map that showed where the telephone call had come from. They didn't know it was George. They thought it was a real fire. Hurry, hurry, hurry! The firemen jumped on the fire engine and on to the hook and ladders. Ding-a-ling, ding-a-ling, ding-a-ling! Everyone, everyone out all of our way. Hurry, hurry, hurry! The firemen rushed into the house. They opened the door. No fire, only a naughty little monkey inside. Oh, catch him, they cried. George tried to run away. He almost did, but he got caught in the telephone wire and a thin fireman caught his arm and a fat fireman caught the other. You fooled the fire department, they said. We will have to shut you up where you can't do that anymore. They took him away and shut him into a prison. How do you think George is feeling right now? George wanted to get out. He climbed up to the window to try the bars. Just then the watchman came in. He got on the wooden bed to catch George, but the watchman was too big and heavy. The bed tipped up, the watchman fell over, and quick as lightning, George ran through the open door. He hurried through the building and out onto the roof, and then he was lucky to be a monkey. Out he walked onto the telephone wires, quickly and quietly, over the guard's head. George walked away. He was free. Good for George. Down in the street, outside the prison wall, stood a balloon man. A little girl bought a balloon for her brother. George watched. He was curious again. He felt he must have a bright red balloon. He reached over and tried to help himself, but uh-oh. Instead of one balloon, the whole bunch broke loose. In an instant the wind whisked them all away, and with them went George, holding tight with both hands. Up, up he sailed, higher and higher. The houses looked like houses, and people like dolls. George was frightened. He held on very tight. At first the wind blew in great gusts, then it quieted. Finally it stopped blowing altogether. George was very tired. Down, down he went, limp on the top of a traffic light. Everyone was surprised. The traffic got all mixed up. George didn't know what to do. And then he heard someone call, "George!" He looked down and saw his friend, the man with the big yellow hat. George was very happy. The man was happy too. George slid down the post, and the man with the big yellow hat put him under his arm. Then he paid the balloon man for all of the balloons. And when George and the man climbed into the car, and at last away they went. To the zoo. What a nice place for George to live. If you've read other Curious George stories, you know that Curious George had more adventures with the man with the yellow hat. But I want you to think about something. Can you tell me that what is the one thing that is the same in the Curious George stories? There's one thing that always is the same. If you're thinking about it and you guess that Curious George is always curious and always getting into trouble, you are right. See you later, boys and girls.